as calls intensify from clergy to the bishops to allow us to offer prayer in our own churches, another debate seems to be getting left by the wayside, and that's about the nature of the Eucharist and to what extent it can be participated online. And to my mind, these things are very much closely connected. I'd like to share some thoughts on that with you today. It's easy to try and draw a hard divide between the positions of those who are mostly saying that we should be in church buildings and that the Eucharist should not be virtually celebrated, and those who say that actually we can all be at home and we can all engage in the breaking of the bread however and whenever we see fit. It's easy to divide that straightforwardly into sort of Catholic and Protestant principles, but actually I think that's far too simple. Rather, the divide that I think this is really exposing is a divide between those who see the world primarily in a sacramental sense as filled with God's grace and mediating that in its own right, and those on the other hand who see the world more as empty matter on which humans might impose their own symbolism and language and gain from it what they will. I think this is really the divide here, and I want to just try and pull that apart a little bit. It's too easy to sort of point the finger at the stereotypical Anglo-Catholic cleric who's sort of greedily feasting alone in some makeshift oratory on the sacrament like a greedy child, while the starving masses are all scraping at the door like some kind of latter-day spiritual dives with all these Lazaruses clambering to the gates. And that's sort of the image that you often find being drawn, perhaps in their spare time, these clergy, when they've taken a bit of time out from darning their vestments, they're live streaming encyclicals about the nature of the Eucharist. And people are saying now is not the time for this, not the time to think about the Eucharist, not a time for talking about how many angels dance on the tops of pinheads. Now we have no services, it's time for service. And if we're doing any theology at all, we should be thinking about pastoral care and not about the Eucharist, not about church buildings. But actually I think that time of crisis is exactly the time to be thinking about the Eucharist, but also about the way the world participates in the Eucharist, including inanimate stuff, including the stuff of the church buildings, because I think actually they have a participatory role in the Eucharist too, not just clergy and laity by any stretch of the imagination, not even just people. And I think our understanding of how these things weave in together are actually going to affect the way we think pastorally about a proper response in time of need. I think the comparison with war is certainly overdone with this coronavirus epidemic, but actually the last time we had a really major shake-up over Eucharistic theology in the Church of England, at any rate, was probably the First World War. And that happened during the war. People didn't wait for it to finish off before they started talking about Eucharistic theology, because it was vital. Partly it led to the allowance of the reservation of the communion for the sick, which until then was forbidden but practiced illicitly by Anglo-Catholic clergy, but also the starting again of requiem masses for the dead, which again had been frowned on by the authorities. They were even seen as disloyal by loyal Protestant establishment churchmen. But now these things, praying for the dead at the Mass and reserving the sacrament to take the soldiers on the front line, these were seen as vital for the life of the country, not only for communicant believers either, and that's important, because the Masses were being offered not only so that people could come and take part and receive communion, but for the dead, who obviously can't receive communion in anything like the earthly sense, and also for their relatives and friends, whether they were communicant Christians or not. These things matter. The Eucharistic theology had a pastoral impact in that case. But actually, I think we need to get a little deeper than that to the theology and ask, is this really about communion and reception? Can the Eucharist be restricted just to who actually receives the bread and the wine? Is Eucharist to be limited, Eucharistic participation to be limited to reception of the Eucharistic host? I want to think back much further than the First World War and back to pre-industrial Christians, for whom I think the idea of participating in the Eucharist would be much, much broader than just receiving communion. Think about it. The people who attended Sunday service, and actually even those who didn't, would have been the people who were making the bread, who were making the wine, who were harvesting the wheat and grinding it and picking the grapes as well. And before the Reformation, all of these activities, the making and baking of bread and so on, would have been blessed by the church, by the local priest, as they still are to some extent in the Orthodox churches of the East. So you've got that idea that the work that goes into the Eucharist, the making of the matter of the Eucharist, the bread and the wine, is part of the Eucharistic celebration. It is a participation at some level. Not the same as receiving, but it's a participation nonetheless. But you could go much broader than that as well, because with the people in their robed choirs singing, or people serving at the altar and having guilds set up to that purpose, people making vestments and candles or giving their money for the building and upkeep of the churches and for the celebration of the Eucharist in them. This all blurs the bound that we seem to set in the modern age between the secular and the sacred. Rather, the sacred spills out into the secular realm, or maybe even in the realm of nature. We find God's grace there, and it's a matter of discerning it and pulling it out. So there's a much wider participation in the Eucharist. There's a participation of inanimate matter, of bread and grapes, of buildings, of vestments, because these are all part of the work of Christ, both in and of themselves and through human hands as well. So I think in a pre-industrial church, you've got this much wider range of participation in the Eucharist than the Reformation might presume, of an ideally literate congregation repeating after the cleric on a Sunday morning, or for that matter, of today's ideally IT literate congregation with computers and decent broadband joining a live stream service at leisure. The self-sacrificial offerings of money or of service, including service to the poor and needy, were seen as part of the Eucharistic action, not something separate from it. And they weaved the lives and the gifts and the trades of the people into Christ's self-offering, way beyond the confines of the church walls or the time of divine service. But the times of service and the church walls needed to be there as the material focal point. So there's this shift, I think, in emphasis from the Eucharist as a participation of all of creation in Christ's self-offering to the Father through the Church as a kind of token of individual salvation through participation in the heavenly feast, received by the individual, me and my God. And that marks not just a pragmatic shift in how communion is celebrated, but also a huge shift in the whole conception of reality. The first millennium of Christian theology was more dominated by this Platonic sacramental idea of reality participating in the supreme good. And so through the social relationships, reciprocal relationships of people with one another, but also with the other goods of creation, the fruit of the vine and the work of human hands, relationship with these things, there was a sense of participation. But then in the late Middle Ages, famously under the late Franciscans, Scotus, Occam et al., this was usurped by this idea of a kind of atomized individual human agent relating by the act of will to one another and to these discrete pieces of matter and to the willing God, to God as a supreme separate being from ourselves rather than as the being in which we participate. And I think there's an irony there, because the Reformers were trying to get away from fetishization of the Eucharistic host and of the sacrament, of abuses of the sacrament. Yet, ironically, by separating it out from the wider activity of this wider world, which was formerly deemed to be participating in God's work, but now deemed somewhat extrinsic to it, they ended up making communion into a commodity, because its value is now determined receptionistically by the faith of the individual consumer. And so we get to the stage where we are now, where we say, well, if having bread and wine on your own in front of the computer screen makes you feel that you're closer to God, then it's true. Reception by faith alone. It results against the instincts of the Reformation, really, in a kind of privatization of the Mass. Not now an interaction of all reality, but more as an individual covenant sign, or sign of the covenant between me and my personal God. And this idea that the Eucharist is just about consumption alone is at the heart of these arguments about whether priests should abstain from feasting, if it's about eating and feasting, while the laity cannot receive. But if the Eucharist is not just about eating, about me going into my garage oratory and scoffing away at the sacrament while everyone's hungry, if it's actually about participating in Christ's offering of all things to the Father, and if it is as such the highest form of Christian prayer, then the solo celebrant is not some lone diner tucking in, but one who pleads Christ's body and blood representatively for the salvation of the whole world. Okay, so there's this idea, I think, of consumerization of the Eucharist here. So what about church buildings? This is the Eucharistic theology, and I'm saying it ties in with this idea that church buildings need to be open as well. At least open for clergy to pray in them, okay? Even if that's all it is. It feeds into this Twitter mantra that the church is about people, not about buildings. We hear that so many times, and it seems self-evidently true. So self-evidently true that people wonder why some people can get so angry about this when the Archbishop of Canterbury says much the same thing. Is this just the lace and gin brigade like me getting a bit shirty? But few have managed to articulate that sense of impropriety beyond a kind of general sense, I suppose. The idea that sacred spaces are hallowed by prayer, hallowed by tradition in some way. But let's look at it in terms of this whole Eucharistic theology of participation. We might see something more. Rather than saying, actually, we can just worship wherever we want, we can always just pray where we want. Well, yeah, sure. Or domestic worship is a fine substitute for this. What about the idea that the very stones and the fabric of the buildings that people have contributed to through generations, and not just the people now, also contribute to the Eucharistic action? And what about not just clergy soul-searching about what priestly orders mean? Why on earth are church wardens? Why have we made our church wardens work so hard for all these generations, keeping the buildings and the stones going and the roofs proverbially watertight, if none of this stuff actually matters? I think this all relies on a basically utilitarian assumption that churches are just convenient places that we place a value on because they're handy, well-located places for distributing the sacramental commodity, as though the Mass is some kind of factory process by which we make the body and blood of Christ. And actually, I think our modern church ordering post-Vatican II of having an altar like a kind of counter over which the shopkeep clergy person presides, handing out, distributing over the table, reinforces this assumption. And you see it writ large, even writ larger, I think, in the Archbishop in his kitchen on Easter Day, cooking up a homely communion for the faithful few. The holy sacrifice, finally, beyond parody, becomes literal breakfast television. But all this isn't just an aesthetic matter, as though anything can be just an aesthetic matter, because what I'm trying to say here is that form and content can't be pulled apart. They have political and pastoral ramifications. The question which our approach to the Eucharist raises is exactly the question of what we think is real. Do we take a sacramental, iconic view of matter, promoted, for example, by Laudato Si, Pope Francis's encyclical? Or do we assume exactly the same dualism between mind and matter as the utilitarians of secular modernity, who see the value of the material realm as being determined just by the individual assertion of will, the value of communion as determined entirely by the individual believer, the value of the church building as what is useful for our distribution of the communion? So the way we answer this question informs our attitude to the whole question of disenchantment and technologisation of the world that you might even argue has played a part in fomenting this crisis in the first place. The abuse of certain animals, the misuse of the world, the way it spread, the coronavirus, through a concern for profit, which, not an unnecessary concern, it gives people's jobs, but when people's lives are put at expense and things are covered up just for the sake of utility, this causes major problems. So it informs our political responses, but it informs our pastoral approach too, because the pastoral approach is going to depend on whether we see God as this primarily other, completely transcendent giver to the supplicant faithful, sort of over the counter as it were, or as the relational Trinitarian good in which we live and move and have our being, and to which all things, animate and inanimate things, the living and the dead, are oriented. And this in turn, bear with me, will inform whether we see priests primarily as, frankly, somewhat paternalistic dispensers of Eucharistic product to hungry and needy individuals, or whether we see them as enablers of participation and reconciliation in the sacrifice of Calvary, not just of people but of the whole world. And so whether we see the poor and the sick themselves as capable of giving and contributing to that Eucharistic reality through their loving service of one another and of us, through their work, through their gifts, or whether we see them more as dependents to be nourished spiritually and physically by the priestly, all-giving hand. And the pastoral implications of that are really quite serious. So for pastoral and political reasons, and for reasons of our entire conception of reality, I'm saying it is exactly the time to be thinking about what the Eucharist means. It is exactly the time to be thinking about church buildings, about the role of priests, and yes, even about vestments. It's time to think about what all these things mean. And it's true that where, vestments, chasubles, are worn without meaning, then they're worse than useless. Might as well get rid of them and be more honest and put on a black gown and some bands. But when I don mine later on and go and sashay off into my garage oratory, I'm not going there wearing it as some kind of bib to catch the crumbs from my gluttonous solo feast. Rather, I'm seeing it as this shadow vestment of the eternal temple where Christ makes his offering for the living and for the dead, for the entire world. And under it I decrease that he may do his work through me. That's only my part as a priest in the Eucharistic offering, and it's only one part. And I think that if I were to neglect that, if I were to fast from it, I would have nothing to offer anyone at all, because I offer nothing, Christ offers through me. But the laity who serve and volunteer, who prepare and deliver food, who provide jobs for people, and who pray the divine office of the hours, that must not be forgotten, the daily office, they're all still participating in a way in exactly the same Eucharistic action as me. I'm only bringing it, or rather Christ is bringing it to me, to its fullness. Non-receiving communion is not ideal, but nonetheless people can participate through their loving service and through their gift of self to Christ. And I think it would be helpful if people were told that. I hope this has been in some ways helpful.